Hi, you're watching theAnalysis-news, and I'm Talia Baroncelli. This is part two of my conversation with economist Djavad Salehi-Isfahani. In part two, we continue our conversation on the effects of sanctions on Iran, as well as globalization and the cheapening of the Iranian workforce. If you'd like to support the work that we do, feel free to go to our website, theanalysis.news, hit the donate button at the top right corner of the screen, and also get onto our mailing list so that you can get all of our content sent directly to your inbox. Make sure you like and subscribe to our YouTube channel or go over to Apple or Spotify to listen to us there. All right, let's get into it again with Djavad Salehi-Isfahani. Joining me now is economist Djavad Salehi-Isfahani. He's a professor of economics at Virginia Tech University in the US and is also a research fellow at the Economic Research Forum in Cairo and research affiliate at the Middle East Initiative at the Harvard Kennedy School. He recently co-authored a book called How Sanctions Work, Iran and the Impact of Economic Warfare, which he co-authored together with Narges Bajogli, Ali Vaez, and Vali Nasser. So we were speaking about the effects of US sanctions on Iran, and you mentioned that sanctions actually have differentiated effects on the middle class. And you made two distinctions. There are sanctions on oil as well as sanctions on financial exchange. So could you speak about these two different types of sanctions and the effects they have?
Well, thank you for that question. It is really the core of my interest in understanding sanctions. You see, when the Iranian government goes to the Americans and say, let the Koreans give us the $7 billion, which shrinks to $6 billion, goes to Qatar and it doesn't come. That whole negotiation is not about the Iranian middle class. It's about, let me have the money so I can provide for the poor. And they can provide for the poor. They can bring more chicken, more food, and so on. What the middle class needs is access to productive technologies, access to markets. They have skills. Those skills are valuable on a global stage. Right now, there are many Iranians savvy with IT who have access to DeepSeek, which is this publicly available AI, and they can do stuff with it if they can sell it abroad. Iranian workers, including IT engineers, are relatively cheap worldwide. They can probably outcompete the Indians, the Chinese, and so on, if there's a level playing field. Right now, that level playing field does not exist, which is an Iranian engineer having access to a credit card with which she can buy new apps that she needs for developing new apps, and then being able to sell that app and have the money come to her bank account, right? That's how bad it is for a representative, sophisticated Iranian engineer who worked very hard. I'm sure this section of the Iranian government is aware of the necessity of having a middle class. Helping this engineer stay in Iran and prosper is symbolically so important for the rest of the middle class to feel they have a place in the country and their country can help them. Just like you send, a volleyball team and they do very well, or a soccer team. These people need government support to go on the global market and do well. And the government hasn't done enough for them. It has told them to be patient, things will improve with joining the BRICS and so on. But everybody knows that ultimately, when you have the new JCPOA, instead of saying, well, we bought 200 new planes for you, would be to say, now if you're sitting in a small town, you have a good internet, and you can compete with anyone on the globe. That's the flat earth, part of the flat earth story of Tom Friedman's that I believe in. You can sell, you can make a new app, and you can sell it globally. I made an example of a software engineer. It could be someone who makes Iranian goods of any kind. I know companies, for example, that make very high quality electrical fixtures. And the owner of that company once showed me a video in which his marks were being placed on Chinese goods much inferior because Iranian goods have a good reputation. This is 20 years old now. Now that dollar has gone to 90,000 2 months, and Iranian workers are benefiting from low domestic price of food and other services. They are very competitive outside Iran, not so competitive inside Iran. And inside Iran, demand is depressed. We have a stagnation. We have austerity, right? So to make something, anything, make a beautiful door that somebody could put in his mansion in Dubai, it's very hard to make the transaction. But if the transactions were possible, the Iranian who would make that door would be doing it at a third of a price of anybody else in the region, because the real is so devalued and the basket of the worker is full of the government subsidies, from healthcare to education to food and so on. So that's the point I'm making. Sanctions that prevent average, medium to small private sector producers from taking advantage of the huge devaluations that Iran has suffered, taking advantage because now their goods are cheap abroad, and produce, employ people, expand their business. Those sanctions are the worst kind. I don't lose sleep thinking Iran cannot sell oil, because in any case, I don't think in 20, 30 years, the world is going to allow Iran to be extracting oil and selling it and polluting the environment. So finding these other ways is the path to the future. And Iran is in a unique position, unlike Saudi Arabia, unlike the other countries in the region whose workers are very expensive. They actually have to bring workers from South Asia in order to produce something and export, which is a real silly situation. Ordinarily, Saudi Arabia would invest in South Asia and let them sit in their homes, produce something and export, right? But right now, that's what they're doing. Iran is poised to show the way how it is that you can throw away your addiction to oil and have a human capital-based economic growth, which has been the path of every other country. If you read economic textbooks, it's all about people having skills and doing well, at least in the last few decades. Before that, robbing other countries was also part of the deal. But right now, if you look at the South Korea, for example, is the human capital that's selling. Chinese, the same. Iranians are poised to do that because through a lot of suffering, the value, the cost of their labor has decreased. At the same time, they've accumulated skills that can be sold globally. So I see a huge opportunity if somehow Iran could get the West to take its foot off the financial neck of Iran. And, I argue whenever I get a chance to speak or to write that this is good for the United States, it's good for the West, because to encourage more pollution, encourage these very, very expensive NEOM projects in the Middle East doesn't have a future. The future has to be a rising middle class with skills that are that can be sold globally, which brings a lot of optimism about globalization. I am ultimately in favor of globalization because all the countries that have developed by connecting to other countries, not just selling to their own people. And if US is interested in a prosperous and a calm Middle East, it has to be a Middle East with a lot of middle-class people with skills that are appreciated globally.
You say something that's quite interesting, because one of the effects of globalization has generally been depression of wages, cheap labor. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's one of the effects of globalization, that you have, as you mentioned, cheap labor sources in other parts of the world. For example, in East Asia, I mean, China has done a lot to actually bring people out of poverty, but for the most part around the world in the global south, the global majority is essentially a source of cheap labor. So I'm wondering why you think globalization might be the way to kind of get Iranians out of the economic predicament they're currently in. And just one other question, if I could ask you, something else that you said that I thought was really interesting. Iran's cheap labor, I mean, if people are getting paid so little, what is preventing them from complete rebellion? Is it the subsidies that are in place, the oil subsidies, for example, that are kind of enriching people's lives and making up that
Yep.
difference so that Iranians have a bit more purchasing power to actually buy the goods that they need? And is, I guess, oil subsidies the way for the Iranian regime to keep people somewhat calm and complacent?
Uh, do you want me to answer this question first? Because I
Sure,
think there
go
were
ahead.
two different questions.
Yeah.
Yes, it has to do with the devaluation that is only occurring in the so-called curb market, the free market, which is not where most of Iran's trade is taking place. So when you have a situation like that and a lot of other goods are being imported, like medicine is being imported, I believe still at the rate of 4,200 2 months per dollar. And some other stuff is being imported at 28,000 2 months per dollar. Some stuff is 55,000 2 months. These are all multiple exchange rates. See? And the exchange rate that a manufacturer who sells abroad now, or that proverbial young IT engineer could get for, is none of these, is the 90,000. If she sells something, she's going to get 90,000. She's not going to get the 55 or 28. If she did that, it would be even. That's not very competitive wage. So the story is that through various mechanisms, the Iranian government keeps the cost of living low in real, which is why we have this thing called PPP, purchasing power parity. World Bank calculates that to get an idea of this gap between the cost of labor outside Iran, the cost of Iranian labor if stuff is sold in Turkmenistan or inside Iran. You can get that from looking at the gap between the purchasing power parity exchange rate, which looks at the cost of buying stuff inside Iran. It's last year it was 9,000, 1/10 of the competitive exchange rate. I would say today is probably around 14, 15,000 2 month, but still a big difference with 90,000. That is the essence of the hidden competitive advantage that Iran has. Now, your other point, my experience is that globalization does not make people poor. It allows the poor people to compete with others. Because it brings to light the poverty in these countries, we start thinking that maybe it happened because of globalization. But all it's doing really is making it apparent. A woman leaves a poor village, maybe exploited by her husband, maybe by the landowner, goes to a factory in Bangladesh. She's very lowly paid. And if you compare her work with a worker, I don't know, in any other country, you say, oh, that's terrible. And you may say that globalization caused that, but you didn't see her before globalization. You were in the village to see what life was like. The fact that she chose to leave home and get the job, have money in her pocket, and maybe get a little bit of education, these are all things that are hidden, and they can be impact of globalization. Now, Iranian globalization is very interesting, and if there's time, we could talk about it. But there's two periods of industrial growth in Iran. One in the 1960s, which is exactly what you said. It is where the poor come to work, and you see poverty actually increasing because, just like the globalization, let's say in Bangladesh, globalization comes with poor people becoming more obvious to everyone. These are the Hoshnashin that left the villages, came to the cities, just like the poor Afghanis who come to Iran to build the roads and water the public parks and so on. So I would say if you look at Iran's globalization with oil, which is 1970s, that's globalization too. It really benefited everybody. The poverty rate fell by half. And a lot of Iranians got stuff in their houses. That's a very different globalization. That's like globalization with people coming and giving you money, like for oil. The globalization that says you got to become competitive requires hard work and requires poverty to be competitive. Those are the two, that's the globalization Iran experienced in the 1960s, can again experience now if financial markets became available to Iran. But we're not there yet. And I'm hoping that we don't go back to the globalization, give us oil money, we are happy, thank you very much, and don't expect anything from us. I like the globalization that says, what can you produce that is better than everybody else? And I'm sure Iranians will succeed in that arena. So I'm looking forward to US becoming a little wiser and allowing Iranian middle class to enter the global stage with some very simple access to banking services to begin with.
So, in response to your comments on globalization, I think perhaps we're talking past each other in a way because there's this race to the bottom where transnational corporations, for example, they're looking for cheaper labor forces due to globalization and to, I guess, limited restrictions on transfer of resources, of goods and services across state borders. They can then, a US company, transnational, can go to Bangladesh or whichever other country to find a cheaper labor source. So, and that's something that globalization has typically enabled. But globalization isn't necessarily the reason why people are poor. Of course, there are other reasons for that. And if you look at the Shah's time, for example, some of his reforms in 1961, the land reforms, as you mentioned, they resulted in some people having less access to the land because they were kind of under a feudal society in a way prior to those land reforms. So they were working the land, but then they became landless and then they had nowhere else to go. So some of them, went to the cities, then couldn't find jobs, and then they were poor. That's maybe not necessarily a result of globalization per se, but is a result of dispossession and land reforms. So are you sort of in favor of a globalization that has, certain standards across the board for workers as well? Because in general, I see it as unfettered capitalism, profit seeking, where companies can do whatever they want. They can have this race to the bottom and search for the cheapest workforce. But there are actually restrictions on human labor. So humans can't necessarily travel wherever they want to find the jobs that they're looking for, or the lives that they are looking for. So I guess the restrictions that are placed on capital and the mobility of goods and services are not the same as those that are placed on humans.
That debate on globalization that you're touching upon makes a lot of sense to me. I think there should be global standards that the society, Bangladeshi society, Iranian society has a duty to take care of its people and not allow foreign capital to come in and exploit its people the way foreign capital did in Africa, sending people to mines and so on. And that was a failure of African states to prevent that. But in general, I think I am on the fence on whether globalization is good or bad. And that's because the countries where people have prospered, their workers have prospered. That includes China, South Korea, and so on. Turkey, in our neighborhood. These are countries that have had access to the global markets. So I think of globalization as a way out for poor countries. Now, the debate we're having now about Iran is very different from that general debate. Mm-hmm. It's a very simple thing. Access to other markets. That's got to have its advantages. I don't see anyone saying, if I can lose my access, I'll be better off. Just does not make sense to me. So how Iran will take advantage of the global markets if and when it gains access, that is important. If the access means bring oil money, and let people get cheap dollars, buy luxury stuff with it, or travel abroad, or buy stuff abroad, not so good. But if it means that all this human capital is accumulated in Iran, that we know is productive, because when they travel, I am part of the conduit for the transfer of human capital from Iran to abroad, because I have a PhD program here and I've admitted the students and I help the students gain foothold in this country. It's sad, but I know these are productive people. Now, they could stay in Iran and compete if the financial markets became available. So I don't see any justification with saying globalization is bad. These people are better off staying in Iran and not doing what normally people do in their country, which is, I have something I can sell. If my fellow countrymen are not buying it, maybe someone across the border is willing to buy. That's my right to do that. And that's, for me, the meaning of globalization. But I appreciate the other debate where looking at it globally and maybe going back 100 years, things were really bad and globalization was very exploitative. Poor central governments, weak central governments, unable to protect their workers, unable to say, if you hire my worker, she has to have a pension because she's going to get old and I can't take care of it. You, the employer, has to come in and provide that. So you have to come in here and help me set up a social insurance system where these workers who are young and strong and productive, when they become old, somebody takes care of them. I want to make sure there's a minimum wage, and all the stuff that developed countries have done has to take place. Globalization without these institutions is very exploitative. But I wouldn't put the blame on globalization, but then saying close the borders, you're better off. I put the blame on weak, incompetent central governments that are unable to provide the necessary protections for the workers who are now joining a world capitalist system.
Right, we're looking at things from a very specific viewpoint, because in the larger grand scale of human development, there's, it's just the past few, I guess, centuries, which have been constituted by nation states, and with, actually having borders. That is not something that has typically been the case. So in general, people have, in past centuries, been able to travel and to share experiences, and culture has developed as a result of people traveling from different places, and as a result of trade. So globalization per se is not a bad thing. It's when there's unfettered profit seeking and accumulation, and transfers of goods and services, and limits on the mobility of people, and
Yes,
trying to
exactly.
extract their surplus wealth, that has actually, I would argue, brought us to the situation we're currently in. So I guess.
So let me just, a very good way you put it. I am against globalization that brings industrial life of the 18th, 19th century England to developing countries, the Dickensian world. I'm against that.
Mhm.
I want the world that workers have now to come. And I have seen enough of that to know that it's possible. In my lifetime, Koreans who were very poor, by some accounts poorer than Iranians, now have decent lives, they're workers. Because Korea made sure that industrialization came to Korea not in a Dickensian style. It came with some Korean cultural, Korean social protection, and so on.
And a lot of
So
state planning as well, actually. It wasn't just
exactly,
federally
exactly.
liberalism, there was centralized planning.
Yes, no private employer thinks about what happens when workers get poor,
Mm-hmm.
when get old. Nobody thinks like that. Or what happens to them when they are fired. We know that. It's the job of the community, the society, to impose restrictions on the employers that you can hire this person, but you are hiring a human being, and this human being is going to get old. What about that? All industrialist countries now have this provision in the employment contracts. And I think if Iranian central government now is, I think, mature enough, is strong enough, and I would say sufficiently attuned to the poor people's needs that if it globalized, I would not see the danger there of the people getting exploited. They already have social insurance, well, it's not very solvent right now, but the system is in place to have an industrial world, a capitalist world in which people are not uh, starving or are getting old and frail and not having health insurance and so on. In states like that, I would say you need global access because you're well protected against this Dickensian industrial society. And let's get the advantages of the industrialization, which is people learn skills and they are able to gain benefits from those skills, if not from domestic market, from outside markets.
And do you think that this would be the only way to transition to, I guess, more sustainable forms of energy? Like if Iran was really pressured for whatever reason, maybe because it's realization of the climate crisis, or maybe people put pressure on its government to do so, if it decided to just leave the oil in the ground and to not touch its oil reserves, how would it be able to then transition to more sustainable forms of energy? Would this, I mean, this would probably would require, undoing all the sanctions on
Yeah.
Iran. Would it then require additional global ties, taking advantage of its highly educated workforce? Or how do you see, in I guess, a hypothetical ideal situation, how would you see that play out?
That's a very good point. I must say, I would never advise the Iranian government to shut its oil fields. I am seeking a balance. For a long time, it has been oil winning over human capital, to put it succinctly in economic terms. I like the human capital to now gain priority over oil. Oil is very good and it helps Iranians buy technology. It supplements their food supply, which is necessary because of their drought and so on. So I see a very important role for oil. I just like the society to see its real wealth in the skills of its people, the way all advanced nations do. They don't look at the mineral under the ground and say, oh, we are lucky. All the British people can leave, but we have coal under the ground. Or just a very simple economic stuff, I think. I see a balanced portfolio with exports based on oil and exports based on human capital, Iranian skills. Because that's what's going to keep skilled Iranians inside Iran happy and proud of what they're doing.
But there is also obviously, lots of climate reporting and also general climate agreements that say that if we surpass as a planet, if we surpass 1.5 degrees in warming, then there could be certain tipping points which then lead the planet to continue to warm even further to, say, 2 degrees Celsius or 3 degrees. And again, I'm speaking in hypothetical terms, but if people put pressure on the government to be aware of these climate crises and these realities, then at a certain point, some of those oil exports would have to be reduced.
Yes. Yes, I think there's a lot of complexity in how that might come about. Right now, we are witnessing the richest country on earth, United States, increasing its pollution. And it will be very hard to convince other countries to cut down on their pollution to save the planet for the United States and for other big polluters. Mm-hmm. I am certain that things will get bad enough for the world to bring an agreement, not like the Paris agreements. It will be a very seriously negotiated agreement where everybody recognizes that oil production is the source of the problem, and natural gas production. And countries like Saudi Arabia will have to find a way. What I'm saying is Iran is better positioned to deal with that, even though right now you might hear from the people, oil, sell the stuff, give me the dollars, because they want to leave the country. If you are leaving the country, all you care about is cheap dollars, right? You can sell your stuff, maybe a house, and then go buy something abroad. But if Iran became a more hospitable place for its trained workforce, I would hope that they will stay abreast of the global dialogue on saving the climate, and they will do their part. When you go hiking in northern mountains north of Tehran, you see young people carrying big plastic bags. They're collecting those. These are not hobos trying to sell that stuff. They care about the place they live, the place they walk, and then they see trash, they pick it up. That's a small example, but it's the spirit of a middle class who is well off to some extent, but also cares about the environment. I like those people to be empowered. And right now, I see the only way for them to become empowered is to be able to live in Iran and sell their skills abroad.
All right, Djavad Salehi-Isfahani, it was great speaking to you. Thank you so much. And I'm sure that we can continue this conversation another time to speak about other issues and other things you've been writing about, such as social inequality. So it's been really very fascinating to speak to you and to get your economic expertise on Iran.
The same. Thank you for the opportunity. I really enjoyed this conversation.
And thank you for watching and supporting theAnalysis.news. See you next time.